perhaps we should start with a chat. So Henna, how did this documentary come about, first of all?
So Dr. Sithwinder Bains of the South Asian Studies Institute, she reached out to me to make this documentary. And at the time, I was an undergrad student at York University in Toronto pursuing filmmaking. And I expressed to Dr. Bains that I was interested in exploring documentary filmmaking and journalism. And I had previously directed 2 short documentaries with her. So then, knowing my experience and interests, she wanted me to make this documentary with her. And when she pitched it to me, it was supposed to be a short documentary. We started filming in like November, December, back in 2020 when the protests started. And at that time, we had no idea that the protests would last this long, and that there would be so many layers to talk about within just the farmers' protests. And so it just became so important to us to make this a longer documentary because we wanted to bring awareness and education to so many people about the many different topics that came to us just through the farmers' protests.
Thank you. Any questions from the crowd? Please just raise your hand, or you can stand up and ask your question.
Can you give us an update of where things are at now since the end of this film?
Yeah.
Henna, everybody, just comment where we left off and where we're at now.
I mean, the end of this film was like 3 years ago. And I can say, like, you know, watching it again, actually, I was just commenting to Henna before it started. First of all, fantastic work. I mean, wove together such a complicated narrative. Yeah, absolutely. And as I sat down, I turned to Henna and I commented, I'm like, wow, I love the new cut. She's like, it's the same film that we saw a year ago. But I think that's kind of telling as well, right? Because there was so much packed into it that myself, I'm realizing that I'm actually learning and seeing different aspects of it, because so much has changed in that time and so much has also kind of stayed the same, right? You know, I think that there's a lot we can get into with the politics of what's going on in India and what isn't. To some extent, I think it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because you're dealing with a hostile actor, right? So the 3 bills, the 5 bills, the 10 bills, the 128 parliamentarians that they ejected, like, it doesn't matter. You're dealing with a hostile actor to some extent, right? The rest just kind of becomes details. And then I think really the perception has to be around, you know, what are you interested in doing, right? And I'm not sure that myself, I'm entirely clear on that anymore. I think I was way more clear then. And even just 3 years ago, I feel like that was such a younger and more naive version of myself. But I think we just need to get clear on what we want to do, right? So I don't dismiss the question by any means, but I've been looking at it that way. So maybe it's just, I don't know, jaded, maybe a little cynical, but I'm like not even paying attention to what the government of India is doing because what? They're going to be violent? They're going to be murdering people? That's news? You know, it kind of isn't.
So how has your perception changed in these past 3 years? I mean, the protest hasn't ended, it started again, and it's happening right now. So how do you think things have changed since then? Jagdeesh?
Sure, okay, I'll take this question. Is this on? Okay. That's a good question because I can also empathize with Mo's cynicism, for lack of a better word. That, you know, there is a lot of frustration, you know, since this government has come into its mandate about 8 years ago. It's had a heavy-handed approach with the farmers, but also with other minorities in India, other groups as well, people in Kashmir, people across India, really, when it came to demonetization. It's always had a very sort of like that heavy-handed, almost ham-fisted approach for its policies. And so now, as Kiran was mentioning, yes, the farmers are protesting again. They've renewed the protest, the Andolan. Now they're on the outskirts of Haryana, trying to get past the border, trying to get into Delhi to once again assure like that the MSP, the minimum prices are going to be actually assured legally. But and the government once again is taking that heavy-handed approach. So while we saw a movie with a lot of struggle, like this documentary, which again was really well done, saw a great deal of struggle. In the end, we did see I guess, that proverbial happy ending. When it seemed like the laws were repealed, we kind of find ourselves in the same situation again, where now the farmers once again are facing violence, are facing tear gas, are facing abuse, trying to secure their livelihood. So as much as things seem to have moved ahead, somehow the circle has kind of come full circle, or the route has come full circle, and we're kind of back into the same situation.
Like maybe with a bit more desensitization though, right? Because like as morbid as this is going to sound, I remember, when the first member of the farmers' protest died in 2020, right? It was a more significant wave of mourning, right? And not to say that, like there wasn't mourning, there wasn't sadness at what happened recently. But I do feel like there's a certain amount of desensitization, right? Because, we heard about it and it's like, okay, that's horrible. But then we moved on to the second death, right? We moved on to the protesters that now they're just doing headshots on occasion, right? So I also feel like there's an escalation that's happening with this, right? So yes, the cycle repeats, but I do feel like the temperature is getting turned up. And I've made this reference before, but it's that effect of, boiling a frog, right? Very, very slowly. It's just, you just crank it up a little bit more. And what the norm is in Punjab, and I think what the norm is in communities of oppression, when you're interfacing with a bad actor like this, right? It might feel repetitive, but I actually feel like, the temperature's being upped. We're just getting used to it, right?
That's a really good point, and I actually want to go back to a point that you touched on, Jagdeesh. This government, the Modi government, seems to really want to segregate people, really, Hindutva and then everything else, labeling farmers Khalistanis, like even you mentioned 3 years ago, and we're seeing this happening more and more in Indian news. If you go, you see farmers, they're not even using the word farmer, it's just Khalistanis. That's how the Indian media is showing news. But a really positive thing that I think came out of that protest in 2020 and after was the farmers' protest turned into Kisan Mazdoor Ekta. It wasn't just farmers, it was farm workers, it was Dalit laborers, it was people from UP who are Uttar Pradesh who are working in Punjab, of them coming together. So how do you see, people coming together under a single banner versus this Indian government trying to segregate people? These two things have been happening at the same time. How do you contextualize that?
I think this is a government which has used that tactic, divide and conquer, divide and rule, going back probably to the colonial era. It's mastered it, but it's kind of, I think from the colonial era, it's kind of gone on steroids because now the government has this amazing tool called social media. We all use it. It's fantastic for connecting with our friends and people we once maybe knew in high school, but it's also a fantastic tool for suppressing people and running these massive troll farms of disinformation, which which discriminate against people, put them into a corner, tag them as you mentioned, Khalistanis, and amazingly enough, in India, it can even recruit celebrities to actually do that dirty work on your behalf because they are also somehow beholden to this powerful center. And the BJP has really mastered this tactic better than any previous Indian government, to the level almost where I would think it's kind of comparable to what you would see in China with the CCP. On the one hand, you call India a democracy. It ranks quite low on the press freedom index level, but the tactics it employs are not that different from what you see in China, and that's very disheartening.
Do you have anything to add, Mo?
Yeah, I mean, I want to maximize the amount of time I spend hating on India, or I should say the government of India. But I do think some reflection is necessary as well, because I think, like the genetics of our community, right? I don't mean like physically, I mean kind of like the cultural genetics of our community are kind of predisposed to the type of divide and conquer stuff that Jagdeesh is talking about, right? So look, it was nice to see the Kisan Mazdoor Ekta Zindabad, absolutely, right? But then there's inclusions and exclusions that we constantly do in our own community, right? The backstory to that fervent speech that I gave on the steps of the Indian consulate was actually one of annoyance, right? Like I had just gone out of the hospital. I was not interested in, rising to, international infamy that day. But I arrived at the protest on Republic Day, and what did I see, right? I saw a division, a tension that was, just boiling on chaos between, members of the community that were foisting Khalistan flags and getting a fair amount of aggression, right, from the young bucks in our community that were foisting Kisan Mazdoor Ekta flags, right? And so I stood up there to be like, get your fucking heads out of your asses, right? Like, what are you here for? Like you're expressing yourself, but trying to kind of enforce the limitation of another type of speech without even understanding what you're facing, right? And I sometimes feel a little disingenuous saying that because when it comes to Khalistan or the politics of Khalistan, right, I was on the other end of the spectrum 10 years ago. And it was just like this thread that I just kind of kept following until I was like, wow, like, it isn't for me to say that, Punjab, the state of Punjab needs to be independent because I'm born and raised in Canada. But I very much believe that, the right to self-determination should exist. And these days when I, thwart various uncles in my family that tell me that, I'm an idiot and I don't know anything, I tell them that, like, the day that you can have a referendum for Khalistan in Punjab, the need for Khalistan will probably have dissolved by then, right? But that's the dichotomy we live in. So to Jagdeesh's point, like there's a lot of tactics that get used on us, but I do feel like as a community, we have a lot of internalized racism, we have a lot of internalized colonialism, and we don't always reflect on the fact that we're kind of genetically predisposed to having those diseases actually affect us like quite rapidly.
That's really interesting that both of you were touching into, misinformation, but we're bringing it home here in Canada. It's been really interesting seeing how the pro-Modi crowd in here has been acting. We saw that letter in the documentary that was sent to the school board or whomever, that why are you teaching your kids this, to now where Indian government is feeling just so emboldened that they're killing Canadian folks on Canadian soil. And then there's whole propaganda happening. There's a lot of talk about India-Canada relationship and whatnot. With the federal election coming up, we've seen Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh really support Canadians and the freedom of dialogue in Canada. But on the other spectrum, there's Stephen Harper, there's Pierre Poilievre and all that. So, and there's a lot of misinformation happening there. Any of you, what do you see as the democratic values going forward? Past this federal election, what's the kind of outlook that you're looking at, or I'm not asking for predictions here, but what does the future of Canada look like?
Can you ask a bigger question?
I have to think.
Tell us, Jagdeesh, what does the future of Canada look like?
I can't ask for the future. The crystal ball is a bit cloudy, but I can say about when it comes to India-Canada relations, I think there is a very pragmatic element that, on the idealistic side, obviously I find a little bit disappointing that, from the United States and Canadian perspective in terms of maintaining relations with this burgeoning power in Asia as a counter to the strength of the Chinese, or for whatever geopolitical reason. I think that pragmatic measure, if it hasn't already eclipsed our expectations of India and its government behaving as a democracy should behave and not killing foreign citizens on foreign soil, I think, not to be cynical, I think it could go in that direction where our material or our geopolitical security concerns or what have you will eclipse those really basic human rights expectations that we would have of more or less any government that claims to be a democracy, but yet somehow finds a way to behave like the Saudi regime, and killing its citizens on foreign soil, or allegedly.
So, like, Trudeau was, when he made the announcement about, government of India's involvement in Trudeau was kind of being held up as like some, Pontic superhero, right? But again, we've known this for 40 years, that interference is happening, that, violence is happening, in diaspora, right? So, you have to kind of look at the motivations as well, right? What motivated this almost like confession in Parliament now, right? And it was because India had overstepped a bit and the US already had a pending investigation, right? And that was going to come to light and they had to kind of preempt that. So what Jagdeesh is describing, right, to some extent, I feel like we're already there. We kind of have been there, right? Like, it wasn't out of just altruism and concern for Canadian citizens that this came out. It's like, why now, right? It's because the timing was inconvenient, right? And it had to be done now, or else there's egg on their face.
There's, and provide a little bit more context into this. And, I know we're focusing on India here today just because that was the subject of the documentary, but, going back as far as the Chrétien government in the early 90s, the Liberal government, they fostered a very close relationship again with the Chinese government and the CCP. And for decades, that regime has engaged in all forms of mischief. And that's a really gentle term. They've engaged in all forms of mischief here, going as far as opening up their own clandestine police stations to police foreign citizens. And so, there's been people in Hong Kong who have been, for more or less abandoned, in their support, in supporting them for their pursuit of, democracy in their city, by Canadian interests that, kind of again eclipse those concerns. And so, with India, it's hard. I'm not a government. I'm sorry. I'm as an individual, as a citizen, I'm just one person. And again, we want to hold our government up to a certain standard, but it's from a realpolitik standpoint, when it comes to governments, it's difficult to imagine how the interests of one or two individuals or small groups of individuals will ever be more important than much larger geopolitical concerns.
I think somebody's arm's getting tired out there.
You talked about the sort of desensitization that can happen after repeated offenses from the Indian government. How do you think that's going to play into the amount of support that this gets and amount of awareness that the new protests will get, and in that the ability of the Indian government to further implement even further policies where people get desensitized? Because I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know that there was the reoccurrence of new protests until I've heard it before this film. And even when I heard about it, similar to how you said, I wasn't as outraged as I was the first time. So do you think that almost sense of how the term used, cynicalism, is going to affect the ability of the Indian farmers who are protesting, their support and their ability to protest? And how do you think that will affect the diaspora and all that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the answer is in your question, right? And we're all guilty of it, but it's a natural occurrence, right? It's called the primacy effect, right? The first time you see something, it hits you quite hard. You see it again, not so much. And so we're seeing the negative impacts of the primacy effect now, right? It's, this is no less critical than it's ever been, right? This is no less important than it was before. But, we're not seeing as much diasporic energy and activity. But I will say this though, right? One of the leftovers from the previous round is that it gave rise to a lot of activity in a lot of communities. There was a formation of a lot of connective tissue, right? And the first time around, it took a long time to actually clear a bunch of fog, right? It took a lot of time to even get aligned around, can a government do this, right? Is a government like that? Could they possibly be, trying to do this to their own citizens? So we are able to fast forward the conversation quite a bit because the watermark is a lot higher than it was 3 years ago, right? So yes, on the one hand, you're kind of desensitized, but on the other hand, that connective tissue doesn't need to be formed and there's not as much fog there, right? So if and when, and they will, things get worse, I think the ability for the community to mobilize is probably a lot greater than it was 3 years ago. The readiness and the vigilance is probably a lot greater. But to some extent, it takes a lot of energy, right? And I think as an energy that, as a community that's been, sort of suffering from waves of oppression, you get attacked, you recover from the attack, and then you wait for the next attack, right? And this is speaking as somebody that, is like physically, emotionally, psychologically privileged growing up and living in the West, right? Like, what am I worried about? And so I'm just talking about like the emotional, like my feelings are hurt. But, for the people that are physically in danger, right? Like that's what they've been going through, is that they go through the physical attacks and then there's a period of recovery. And, I feel like just when the healing's kind of, there, the next wave happens.
Actually, can I make a comment on that as well, on the cynicism aspect? There again, this is sort of like I don't want to make this like the glass half empty, glass half full. Like I don't want to look at it from that perspective. But if I'm going to be somewhat of an optimist, and there's lots of cynicism that we've talked about here today. There's lots of the downsides that we've kind of expressed. But in the end, the farmers, for a year, they mobilized, they parked themselves in Delhi. They built internal institutions. They used seva. They used like Sikhi concepts within Sikhi to help sustain their momentum. And in the end, they won, at least back then, like for whatever that victory was worth. And in the David versus Goliath context, when I first started writing about this issue back then, I was not expecting like the farmers to win. I was expecting them to kind of eventually peter out, lose momentum, and the government to just maintain its very hard stance, because that's what this government has done again and again and again. But in the end, farmers won. And if there is a light in all of this, is that there is still a spark of democracy. There is still a little bit of democracy left in that country. And I think that that's something that I'm not saying it's going to continue or endure, but there was a little bit, if you want to look at it from somewhat of an optimistic standpoint, there is a little bit of that to counter some of the cynicism that we're feeling here today.
And I would like to add that I think, yes, I agree with both of you, but there's still people in the Indo-Canadian diaspora who are ready to protest. Just on Sunday, on the 24th, there's protests organized in Toronto and in New York, and I'm sure we'll see soon some being organized in Vancouver. And I think if I speak from the point of view of a first generation, I don't want to lose hope. I want to go to India again. I don't want to be exiled. Mo, I know you're internationally feared.
I think it's too late. I don't think you produce a documentary like this and get a visa.
Well, maybe I should try applying for one after this and we'll see. But I have hopes, and I have hopes because my parents sacrificed so much for us to be here. And like the last time I went to India, I was 11 years old, and I walked through our farms. And I was just like a naive kid. I didn't feel much, but I'm sure that if I go to India again and I walk through our family farms, I will feel something. I'm so sure of that. And I like my mom is smiling right now because she knows.
Thank you. Yeah, next question. Thank you.
I'll just yell it out. So you've actually kind of started the question that I have, and it relates to this resurgence of farmer identity. And if we think about the dislocation from agriculture that we've probably seen in decades past, this particular protest, and also this move or pursuit and encouragement from our parents and grandparents towards upward mobility, a disconnection from the Kisan identity of our parents and our grandparents. I'm curious, when you think about that, you think about age, you think about gender, you think about caste, about your thoughts, your observations, the not in the moment impact, but the sustainable impact of the farmer identity, particularly on those who are first generation, second generation. Now, a lot of our international student brother and sisters who are coming here. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
interestingly, I actually just gave a talk to the Ministry of Agriculture on that topic like last week. And so I feel like disconnection from farming is kind of a disconnection from humanity, right? And this might be a little off topic here, but you think about like civilization, our society, the reason we exist the way we do, it's entirely because of farming, right? 12,000 years ago, some, members of the human race decided that even though it's more, calorie intense to do agriculture, right? Because hunting and gathering is actually a lot cheaper on calories, right? It's opportunistic. It's way harder to do farming, right? But they decided that the stability and living in community was providing, sort of greater dividends, and evolution kind of rewarded that as well, right? So everything that we have, everything in civilization, everything in society, everything that we hold, to be the sort of pinnacle of human advancement, you can point to 12,000 years ago when we decided to start farming, right? And we said that collective stability was more important than individual success, right? So a disconnection from farming is a disconnection from humanity, right? And that would be my biggest argument to reverse, reduce, prevent any corporatization of this human practice.
And do you see the resurgence of that farmer identity as an opportunity where our generations pre and post us, are stepping into that mindset? Because I see our community also struggles greatly from a disconnection to humanity, right, in pursuit of that upward mobility. And so I'm excited by the possibility of the farmer identity resurgence being an opportunity to reconnect with that. So yeah, that would be my follow-up, if you see that as an opportunity or the sort of spark kind of emerging for that to ignite.
I think there's a huge opportunity there, but as with anybody in society, like if there's a virtue, you need reminders, right? And it was quite inspiring to see, the singer Sidhu Moosewala, right, who had attained, every level of material success you could think of in the media environment, right? And that's not for the faint of heart. And even after attaining that material success, he quite, with a lot of humility and authenticity, liked to display his connection to his farmland and his enjoyment of tractors, right? And it was a very again, very human thing for him to do. And I think it was a great example and a reminder, right, that you too can be this human.
I can add one thing to that. Is I would say that it's a very human thing, as we're talking about like human traits, for us not to really know what we have until we lose it. And, for the generations of immigrants who left Punjab and India and other parts of the world, and when they move abroad to Canada, they're upwardly mobile. Certainly their income grows over time. They tend to do, reasonably well. But I think a part of them, and even their offspring, I'm second generation, I think they always still yearn and look back at, with a lot of nostalgia, romance, some of it perhaps misplaced, but I think some of it very heartfelt for that sense of rootedness in, Pind Diyan Galiyan, as Gurdas Mann would say, like those places that they once occupied and that anchored their identity. And whether that's in Punjab or whether that's in France or whether that's in Spain, Argentina, wherever you have farmers, that sense of rooted identity has a firm grip on one's sense of self and one's sense of self-worth.
Thank you. Any other questions? I actually kind of want to take a little pivot into journalism now. You're a seasoned journalist. You've been working in this industry for so long. We were talking earlier, this is what you want to do. You want to tell important stories through documentary. You talked with so many journalists out from India for your documentary, and what you're seeing here now. How do you sort of compare the two? Are you still excited about doing this going forward?
I think I am way more excited than I was, because I think I was really naive making this documentary. I felt a lot of guilt, like among other emotions, making this, and I think I felt so much guilt making this because I wasn't well aware of a lot of issues that I learned while making this documentary, and I feel like just making this opened up conversations that I didn't have before with my grandparents. Like every time I see my grandparents, now they feel like they can talk to me about like, oh, like this is going on in India, like this is what the government did now. And that never existed before. Like we have opened up just new conversations, and I feel like making this documentary, I felt naive, but then I also felt a lot of energy and motivation to make this, coming from that background and having like my family members as lineage of being farmers in Punjab, India, and then also coming from a Sikh family that added another layer to this documentary. And yeah, like just watching this, I think there should be like a part 2, and I think I should keep making documentaries about this, and maybe one day with my grandparents and have them talk about it as well.
So what is it gonna call, the part 2 rail, jails and trolleys, or do you have a name?
I'm open to suggestions, so.
I would actually kind of add to that. I would say like no different than your recent piece on Gidda. Like I think it's critical, no different like this Rails Trails documentary, that it's critical that, and I'm using the word we loosely, we tell, and again, I will use that word loosely, our stories. Because, I mean, speaking from a very specific Punjabi Sikh contextual background, my grandparents were illiterate. I mean, I can't say that to my father and son, but you know, going back, you know, a number of generations, they were not, you know, educated, and they didn't tell their own stories because they couldn't. And because they couldn't tell their own stories, other people told their stories on their behalf. And whether that was the English or the colonial masters at the time, or whether it was other educated groups who came along later, you know, we now can reclaim some of that ability. And it's sort of an obligation upon our generation and further down to tell, and again, I use the word loosely, our stories. And I'm glad you did.
Follow up on that. How do you do that when we're looking at India? It's all propaganda now. The media has been sold, and here, people are being labeled as fake media. How do you continue doing that?
That is the second half of the answer, where like everything spills off a cliff, because it's extremely difficult. Because on the one hand, I think it is critical to tell those stories. I think it's critical to have that information and those narratives out there in a packaged form like you've done today. Now, how you ward off all the disinformation and all the waves of trolls and all the propaganda and all of the fake news, political jargon and statements, and that cynicism which spills into the actual readership and the people who are going to view, and now really look at every content piece with a overly critical eye. That's a different challenge, but there is a possible solution, which I believe is credibility built up over a long period of time. If you continue to do the work, if you continue to be credible, if you continue to do solid reporting, solid research, and you continue to put that out there, you will eventually gain a following, and you will eventually gain that sort of really rare brand as a trusted source. It just will take a lot of time, and you will be assaulted again and again by waves of trolls. But that's kind of the only way forward that I can see.
Thank you. Any last questions before we wrap? Yes.
What's next for the film? I would love to tell 1 million people to come. I know this place packed, and I'm ready to sign up for the next protest. This is incredible, and we need to, have this dialogue going more, given the updates and everything. So what's next? I would love to. Yes.
So. Yeah, Dr. Baines and I have been talking about what's next for the film. We want to keep distributing it to film festivals, but we also want to make it publicly available so that anyone can watch it. So, and then also we want to put it in classroom settings, because I think this is actually a very academic documentary, and it would give so many students the opportunity to take notes and have meaningful discussions. So. I would say we will make it publicly available pretty soon. I'm in works of that right now with Dr. Baines, and then after that, this is a UFV production, so we'll be trying to get it around classrooms in UFV and hopefully other universities as well.
Anybody else? Going once, twice? All right. Any last words before we wrap? I'll go this way. Jagdeesh?
No, just that I hope you continue to do more documentary work. This was a really welcome addition. Well done.
Well, I hope you'll both be my interviewees again, because I think you were both amazing interviewees.
Yeah, I look forward to it, and I gotta say, like, it was pretty validating, right? Like, you sometimes pretend like you have all the confidence in the world to like stand up and say things, and then get attacked for it. But it's like it offered a lot of validation, right? Because during this last couple of years, and especially in 2021, when we launched Ask and DIY and the attacks happened, and Go the Media went wild. As much solidarity as we built and people came out of the woodwork and there was a lot of expressions of love, we also became radioactive to certain members of our community, right? You'd enter a room and there would just be like this, this like drift away from you. And it can be quite isolating, right? So I think, being a part of this, frankly speaking, I think it was good for my mental health. It was just nice to see that we were validated to say, okay, something good happened here. Some people found some meaning in it. So it was personally very encouraging, and hopefully collectively encouraging to the wider community to get involved and do something.
And you can do something. I'm sure there will be protests happening here soon. So, if you want to stay up to date, you can go to Sikh Expo. They post a lot about the current news from reliable journalists in India, independent journalists who are at the protest sites right now. Other than that, I would say go to askindiawhy.com.
Thank you. Thank you so very much to all three of you for being here, spending this time with us. Thank you so much, Henna, for this incredible documentary. And thanks to our audience for being so patient and being a really good audience. Can we have a last round of applause for our panel?